I need to get some sort of like token to send to people who actually do it when I say.
Yeah, we could do it.
To reward in some way, because nobody ever does.
Well, folks, if you put on your video, you might get a token.
But probably not.
Yeah.
You have some socks.
There you go.
1/10 of a sock. I'll send anyone 1/10 of a sock who puts on video.
There you go.
That's like
By the way, 10th of a
$20.
sock.
That's
Yeah.
that's no joke.
Oh, there
Here
we
we
go.
go. We got one more.
Miles got tempted by 1/10 of a sock.
There we go. It'll be in the mail. Just keep an eye out for a very small
Little
package.
do you know, I meant a physical 1/10 of a sock, not a digital one.
Cool. I think we're good. Hayden, if you can multitask, we can you can retweet the live stream.
Yeah, I don't. Okay, let me do that right now.
Cool. Other than that, I'll let Jacob do an intro and then we can get started.
Yeah, sure. So cool. Yeah. So first of all, thanks so much for being a part of this, Hayden and Noah. We're excited to have Uniswap as part of HackMoney and excited to be doing this as I think probably our last final event of HackMoney before judging. So we've come to the end. It's been an exciting 4 weeks. Your team has been super helpful in the channels and just everywhere, helping people out and build on top of Uniswap. So I know I'm excited to see what people have built. I assume you guys are as well. But in the meantime, maybe we'll do a little bit of chatting about, how we got to Uniswap V1, some updates about V2, which, as everybody should hopefully know, launched on mainnet very, very recently in the last week, which is amazing. Just in time for people to bring their HackMoney projects to mainnet too. So perfect timing there. And yeah, just kind of get an idea of the story, what's up with V2, and of course, an opportunity for you guys in the audience, kind of around the world, to ask some questions to the team as well. So with that out of the way, maybe we'll start with a couple of questions maybe for Hayden, and then we'll jump into some V2 stuff, and Noah, I'd love to get your opinion on that. So Hayden, I'd love to know kind of how you got into Ethereum in the first place, and maybe what you were working on beforehand. I know it's an interesting story. I think it would be cool for everybody else to hear too.
Yeah, before working on Uniswap, I was a mechanical engineer. So I graduated in 2016, May 2016, from engineering school. And then I spent a year working as a mechanical engineer, doing like thermodynamics, basically like tracking heat flow and car designs. I was working at Siemens. I got laid off after about a year. And I was, at the time I was starting to get a little bit into crypto. I had a friend, Carl Flourish, who at the time was working at Consensus, and then he moved up to the Ethereum Foundation. And so he was kind of delving really deep into Ethereum and would, talk to me about it and was kind of trying to get me interested. I didn't really care that much until the price went from like $5 to like $100 in like a few months. And then I was like, okay, maybe it's interesting. But it timed out nicely where I got laid off and I had a call with Carl, and he was basically like, congratulations, you're now an Ethereum developer. I was like, I don't really know how to develop that well, but I guess I'll try it out because I didn't know what else to do. So I spent a few months experimenting with Solidity, learning how to write token contracts. But I wasn't really sure, like, what, I don't know, it just started to feel like I needed like a bigger project to learn on. And so, Carl actually, once again, he kind of pointed me towards this blog post from Vitalik, which was talking about automated market making and, a different way to kind of make a trading platform or an exchange. And that ended up being kind of like the earliest version of Uniswap. And I spent a few months kind of building out, just basically kind of trying to learn Solidity. And I, built out an initial proof of concept that turned out pretty well. And once I had that, kind of, I started to go to a lot of Ethereum events and meet more people. And I, heard about other projects in the space like Bancor and other, Bancor was kind of at least in doing some similar things. And, I did get some ideas from there, kind of going from just like this thing that could swap between two tokens to like a thing that could like hop between and go anything to anything. And, I kind of just continued working on it. Still pretty much unemployed for this entire time, living at home for a good portion of it. Occasionally doing a little contracting work, but I just kept working on the smart contracts and a interface for it, and I kind of eventually built out like a good enough proof of concept where I met some people at the Ethereum Foundation. I met Vitalik in basically spring 2018. And he kind of recommended I apply for an Ethereum Foundation grant. So I did that. I got an Ethereum Foundation grant, and I kind of paid contractors to build out a front end and do design work. And I kind of finished up the smart contracts and paid smart contract auditors and formal verifiers to kind of make sure that they were secure to the extent that we could be at the time. And then that kind of like turned into Uniswap, which was pretty cool.
Very cool. And yeah, I mean, obviously, like, I think most people on this call will be aware of like the kind of explosion that Uniswap kind of, it almost became like a mind worm, I felt like, where it was like, there were all these other things and all of a sudden it was just Uniswap and everybody just used Uniswap. And it became very popular very, very fast. Like, what do you think led to that? Like, was it kind of any specific design choices you made, or like, was it that like, it was like significantly better in every way, or just in a specific way? Like, what do you think led to it just like, taking off like a rocket ship?
Yeah, I think it definitely wasn't something I was expecting or anticipating. When I was working on Uniswap, the kind of the scale of what I was expecting it to be relative to all these projects that had done these like huge ICOs and that were like a lot more established, I wasn't necessarily expecting it to kind of compete in the same way. The kind of design choices behind it were like, how do we, some of it was very UX focused, like, this kind of this feeling where you just like, the only thing you need to interact with is a smart contract. And so it's just like, I put in this token, I get out this other token, and it feels almost like a vending machine. There was like that kind of design improvement compared to like at the time it was coming out, Ether Delta was, I think, still like the most popular trading platform, which was a lot kind of more complicated to use. And then kind of some of the other design choices, it was like, how do we make a trading platform that's kind of mimics the underlying properties of Ethereum itself? Something I noticed about a lot of projects being built on Ethereum when I was working on Uniswap was like, they kind of made various sacrifices at various different points on sort of some of the underlying properties that I cared about most for Ethereum. Like if something built on it, like Ethereum is very censorship resistant, but a lot of projects built on top of it aren't. And so the idea of Uniswap was like, can we make something that's as decentralized as Ethereum itself and is as hard to like, is kind of as unstoppable and as trustless as Ethereum itself. And I think that kind of resonated with a lot of people. And, there was just like, it felt like a little bit different from a lot of other projects. And I think that got a lot of initial excitement. And I think another thing is just like the fact that you can sort of trade anything for anything on Ethereum. And like, you don't need professional market makers. Like for like the order book model, you always need like professional market makers to make sure that there's liquidity for like any token. But for the sort of like longer tail of tokens, it's hard to scale professional market making. So having this sort of like automated liquidity provision where you can just like lock up your tokens in a smart contract and then there's like liquidity for those tokens forever, it's like a fairly powerful thing.
Cool. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, let me see. So I mean, so you've got V1. V1 is doing very, very well. There's a lot of growth. Lots of people are using it. When did you start to realize maybe this needed to have a V2?
Basically, as soon as it like was doing an absurd amount of volume and had an absurd amount of traction, just like this scale of like resources that had been put into like thinking about building Uniswap. I mean, it was literally just me working on my own for like most of the time for V1. And you heard the story I told at the beginning. Like I wasn't that experienced as an engineer. I wasn't, it was like the first version of it. And it's kind of hard to get something perfect on the first time. I wouldn't say V2 is perfect either. I think, we're already starting to think about a V3. We can get into, that stuff later. But the point is that like, when this thing started doing, $1 million a day in trading, I was like, okay, we have to work. No, this thing clearly has proved itself as like a concept, but I was very sure that it wasn't like in its ideal engineered state. And so, I definitely thought it was worth kind of continuing to iterate on and improve.
Got it. Cool. So now you're like thinking about improving it. What was sort of like the first thing you knew that like, in V1, I was either maybe really worried about this or like it's something that I wish I'd built in the first version. What was sort of like kind of the initial feature that you thought would be a perfect candidate for V2?
I think that the first one we decided on was probably the arbitrary pairs. allowing any ERC20 to be paired against any other. It was definitely like the most requested thing that a lot of people would bring up. They wanted to, denominate it in stable coins or kind of have two like very like, like common, two things that were like highly correlated. They wanted to, be a liquidity provider on that and not have as much price risk. And they couldn't because everything was kind of forced to be denominated in ETH. And I think ETH is a great pair, and I think it will probably always be like the most common one, or one of the most common ones. But kind of, adding in sort of this broader, options was probably like the first, thing. And I was very resistant to the idea early on, but just because there's like a more complicated like routing thing that occurs. Yeah.
Awesome, sweet. So maybe we'll let Noah jump into these ones too. So feel free, I would kind of get an answer from both of you guys for these kind of open questions. And ideally pick different features so that you can talk about more V2 features. So maybe starting with Noah for this one, what is for you the most exciting feature of V2 that you think is going to have the biggest impact?
Interesting. I don't know. That's a good question. I think something that I was actually very hesitant about adding one particular feature, which is flash swaps. So we were really close to the end of the contract life cycles. We were getting them formally verified. They were kind of in our minds frozen. They'd been stable for quite a while. And then I think Dan Robinson, who's one of our investors and kind of brainstormers when it comes to these kinds of things, had this idea, and Hayden had kind of thought about this as well. And it's basically this idea of flash swaps, which has been around for a bit now. But we had this really nice design of this really nice way to add it into V2. And so that was a call we had to make on whether or not we were going to add that. And I was I was playing the kind of cautious side of things, and Hayden and Dan were kind of pushing me in the other direction. And we ended up going with adding it, and that tacked on some time to our formal verification. And it did kind of initially add this kind of additional complexity to the kind of underlying mechanics of a swap on Uniswap. But I think the more that we spent time with the code, we actually realized it was like a really natural kind of it kind of fit really naturally into the way that we were already thinking about the invariant and preserving these properties about the contracts and things like that. So anyway, we ended up getting it in, and I think that it's actually it's a bit complicated, I think, right now for people to use because it's so new. But I do think that it offers a lot of really interesting kind of atomic abilities to like atomically arbitrage and loop through kind of other protocols and do things up front that you would otherwise have to do in an iterative way. And so I think that, and it's also kind of on the flip side of things, it's also forcing projects who might be vulnerable to, flash loan of governance tokens to kind of be aware of the fact that this is, we don't want to encourage that kind of behavior, obviously, but, at the same time, if it's possible on some other venue, we might as well kind of be like accelerationist in that regard and kind of force, this new standard, this higher standard of security for all these projects. And so, we made sure to be, appropriately cautious and, talk to people who this might impact and such. But at the end of the day, we did feel like it was a reasonable feature to add, and we do think that there's a lot of benefits. And so, yeah, that's something I think that's going to be pretty exciting to see where it goes.
On the security thing, to add to that, like if you can, if being able to flash, like if being able to flash swap some token from Uniswap impacts the security of your system, then you should be aware that you can already flash loan a ton of ETH from DYDX and then atomically buy any token on Uniswap and then attack those same systems. Like any system that is broken by flash swaps is already broken by a combination of DYDX and Uniswap v1 essentially. So that was like one thing that kind of helped us get comfortable with sort of adding it, despite some people's initial like concern about it as like behind like what some of the implications might be. I'll also add my personal answer to that question would probably be the oracles. I mean, I already mentioned ERC20 pairs, and I think those are super important. I do think that like having on-chain price feeds that are very decentralized and also very easy to reason about. A lot of like on-chain oracle systems kind of depend more on people voting on a price feed or various trusted parties kind of coming together, and you're averaging across them and all that. And this is like very different from any of those. It's very much just based on like, what's the amount of money you would lose moving the price on Uniswap away from the real price, and then what's the amount of money that would cost and you would lose to arbitrage if you did that every block for 1,000 blocks, if you're doing a 1,000 block average. And so it's a lot more easy. It's like a lot easier to reason about, and for some use cases, I think it's going to be really, really cool and important.
Cool. Awesome. What about kind of the feature that was maybe the most challenging to build, and maybe it would be great to dig into what kind of hurdles you guys hit when you guys were trying to build this thing out?
Do you want to take that one now? What do you think was most challenging?
That's a good question, actually. I think so. Well, one, I think, okay, so I'll talk about one really thorny one. Hayden, feel free to maybe do some more broad one, but something that's like very technical and specific, but actually potentially kind of pretty bad is this issue of like minimum divisibility. So in Uniswap v1, the way to determine how many pool tokens, a given amount of ETH and a given amount of token would give you is basically, it just gave you the amount of pool tokens corresponding to how much ETH you sent to the contract, which is pretty reasonable, right? Because like ETH is, in v1 at least, it was this canonical base pair. It kind of had this idea of enshrined value, and it was kind of a reasonable like unit of account for v1 pool shares. But in v2, we obviously don't have this feature. We don't have this property anymore. Not every pool has an ETH component. And so we had this problem of how to denominate pool tokens. So you might just think that you could pick like the minimum or the maximum, or maybe like the average, or even in Uniswap style, like the geometric mean, which is the square of the root of the square of the product. Sorry, the root of the product. Like if you send 100 Y and 10 X, you do root 1,000. But it turns out that there's actually all these attackability issues with that. So if you mint like the minimum number of pool shares, like you send one way of one token and one way of another token, that'll give you out root 2 or whatever, root 2 rounded down, which is one way of pool shares. But then you can actually send a bunch of value into the pair, right? You can just send, because Uniswap can't control the token balances of any arbitrary contract, so someone could take, a million way, or 1 unit, say, of this token, and another 2 million of this other token, send those to the contract. And then suddenly one way of pool tokens denominates this incredibly large amount of liquidity, right? And so that's it's this kind of really arcane attack. Like it's not really, attack is debatable, I guess, but it's this really arcane kind of pattern, and it's not something you typically do, and there's no real reason to do that. But it turns out that if you do that, then it kind of is this barrier to entry to new liquidity providers. And so you actually have to have above the threshold of tokens that were sent to the contract in order to get even one way of pool shares and kind of contribute to being an LP. And so you can get around this obviously by like wrapping or doing other things, but it's kind of frustrating. And so we did actually find a way around this. We essentially just enforced that there's this minimum threshold of liquidity tokens in the minting process. So the first liquidity provider kind of has to burn this small, tiny, minuscule fraction of pool shares. It's typically like less than a cent for almost any reasonable pair out there, and it kind of ensures that there's always going to be this kind of very small unit of measurement, unit of pool tokens that ensure that this divisibility issue can't get that bad, right? Because there's some multiplicative factor on how bad this divisibility can get. So very technical, very specific, but these are the kinds of things you have to worry about. Even though it's not that realistic, and there's really no incentive to do what I was describing. Like there's no actual benefit. Well, there's no real big benefit that we could think of outside of just kind of griefing, but you do have to be aware of these kind of things in permissionless systems. So that's one thing that we had to deal with.
Yeah, V1 has this griefing attack actually. So you could, if someone deploys a new pair, then like if you're the first liquidity provider, you can create like any arbitrary minimum liquidity threshold to become a liquidity provider for all future users. So if you're the first liquidity provider on a pair on Uniswap, you could maybe set that to $1 million, and then say anyone else who wants to join the pool has to put in at least $1 million. We didn't really realize that until well into the V2 design process. And it's not like you can't steal people's money who've already put in pools, and it can't affect existing pools. But if for any future pools, actually, if someone's aware and they could start deploying, they could do this great thing. My answer would be oracles, probably. There was like this idea of like, how do we, when we were like first doing the oracles, it was like, like we were thinking about, do we store like a built-in moving averages, like 1 hour averages, 1 day averages, kind of built into the contracts. And we started to realize that it was really hard to choose like what periods of time to average across. And so we ended up on this other Oracle system where we're storing these price accumulators that let anyone else building on top of it kind of choose their own periods they care about. And it ended up kind of solving the problem really nicely. But I think it took a while to kind of get to the current Oracle design for sure.
Very cool. Maybe jumping forward a little bit to maybe what could be a future feature. I think it was at DevCon last year, a project called Unipig, or in general, kind of layer 2 Uniswap. I think we're sort of settling into the new normal that gas prices are quite high, and they've been quite high for a while. Maybe first of all, like, how do you guys feel about like gas prices being this high? Does that affect users? Does that affect like liquidity pools at all? And otherwise, like maybe just chat a little bit about like, could a layer 2 Uniswap V2 exist? What could that look like? Should it be something that somebody should have built this hackathon, or maybe the next?
I think that that's a good question. So first off, it obviously does impact everyone who uses Ethereum, in that like all users are paying more towards gas fees, and it kind of sucks for them, and it's kind of a and it sucks for the platforms themselves, because it might disincentivize future usage if people have to pay a lot of fees. So yeah, it's not great. The way that I think about layer 2 solutions is I think that like a lot of kind of past layer 2 solutions that people have thought about a lot, like Plasma, and like a lot of sort of different ideas people had, they all had sort of it all felt like a huge sacrifice on like what it meant to be an application on Ethereum. So like when you're building on top of Ethereum, you have like some really, really, really nice properties where you have like this kind of ability to kind of interoperate between other applications on Ethereum without needing to like, deposit into an application and then withdraw. Like you can just basically like use tokens on Uniswap and then use them in Compound and use them in Maker. And you don't need to like worry about like withdrawals and exits and right. And so, being able to kind of like seamlessly interoperate between applications is like such a core property. And then like another core property is like just like the development experience of Ethereum is actually like, some people complain about it, and most like Ethereum killers like say that like it's horrible, but like actually building on top of Ethereum is pretty great. And there's like a ton of tools, and there's like a ton of, it's writing smart contracts isn't too bad. And like I think that the layer 2 to kind of completely take off and fill the needs of like Uniswap, it needs to have these like underlying properties of Ethereum, which are like general interoperability, the ability to write general smart contracts like out of the gate, and not need to like be able to like the applications themselves. I don't think should be creating these like really, really intense, complicated things like what some of the past scaling solutions have required. And so like I think optimistic rollup is like the right level of trade-off where you can actually create like a general smart contract platform on optimistic rollup that like interoperates like out of the gate. And so I'm a big fan of the formerly the Plasma Group team. They're now called Optimism, and so they're the people we collaborated with on Unipig. And they're working on like a general smart contract optimistic rollup chain. And I expect to see a version from them that's mainnet ready at some point. And I'm very excited for it personally, and I do think that it would be worth putting Uniswap on, Uniswap V2 on. So something to note there is that like if for it to be ready for you, like for it to be the layer 2 that like wins or whatever, or like gets DeFi on it, like it needs to kind of support Uniswap. Basically, it needs to require it needs to be like Ethereum, where we can just like deploy Uniswap to it, and we don't need to like build a whole like back end to it. And so we're waiting on that to some extent, but we're expecting it to happen fairly quickly as well.
Got it. Cool.
Days, not weeks.
Yeah.
Neither days nor weeks. Some longer period of time than that. But I would say that like I wouldn't be surprised if it was less than a year. for us to have like a general purpose. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not speaking for them. For us to have like a fully general purpose, optimistic rollup chain with native solidity and all that stuff. But we'll see.
Cool, awesome. And yeah, I think this will be the last question from my end. So anybody in the chat, if you have questions, start thinking about them, write them in the chat, and we'll call on you one by one. And you can just kind of ask it live. But maybe just to wrap up this section, as you think back from, your development of V2 to V1, like what are some of the things you noticed that were sort of like beginner mistakes that you had made, or things that otherwise like just made things more difficult, as you were like thinking about designing further software? What are some things that maybe first-time developers or even seasoned developers should be thinking about when they're putting together a protocol?
I don't know if I'm fairly happy with how V1 went, but I'll say that like mistakes, definitely obviously like informing people of risks. There have been people who kind of, like sort of seeing things and being like, well, no one would ever do that. That's really dumb. And then like all of a sudden, like hundreds of people start doing that. So like I think that just like being really, really, really like extremely careful with informing people, of the risks of using things and kind of the that is like one thing that I would maybe highlight. Trying to think. And I guess also like the trade-off. I think that the mistakes that a lot of other projects are making it's just like being aware, and probably we've made those mistakes as well, is like being aware of the trade-offs that you're making, like super hyper aware, because sometimes people make like what feels to them like a very minor trade-off, and it just like very fundamentally changes like the entire like all the security properties of their system. Where suddenly like this one small like change that you made, like now you're like dependent entirely on like some small trusted party for like everything in your system to work. So yeah, I just think like trade-offs are like under considered sometimes, like the implications of them. I don't know.
Got it.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I think the one thing that, just from a slightly more practical perspective, that differs between V1 and V2 is that V2 has this kind of core helper separation, where the core contracts are kind of very minimalistic, very brutalistic, and really only exist to kind of verify the security and safety of Uniswap, and make sure that X times Y equals K is preserved, more or less, and that liquidity providers aren't going to be fleeced in any way. And then we have this whole constellation of external contracts which are responsible for maintaining oracles and performing flash swaps, and even just doing the very basics of kind of routing between multiple pairs in order to support trading for users and front-end interfaces. So I think that this is really nice because it's very extensible and it's very flexible, and approves can be given fairly freely to these kind of helper contracts, because they should be extremely simple, stateless, never doing anything that's at all suspect or complicated in any way. So very easy to verify the properties of. And so that's something that we're pretty excited about, just because there's always new exciting ways to like transfer ERC20 tokens, or perform different types of swaps that swap to like different swap to prices, or other kinds of things. So that's something that we're kind of we want to keep doing going forward, and we'd like to see other projects do, is kind of separate out these core pieces of logic from helpers.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a good answer, but much better than mine.
Sounds good. Cool. Awesome. Well, let's turn this over to the audience. Ultimately, like why we're here. So, I think Vineet had a question. Vineet, I don't know if you're able to like unmute and ask it yourself. If not, I'm happy to repeat it.
What went into determining the 0.3?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'll read it for stream too. So yeah, so the question from Vineet, who's not able to say it out loud right now, is what went into determining the 0.3% fee? Are there ideas around making that variable? I guess basically trying to get a sense for how we arrived at that number.
Yeah, I'll say that like in terms of so the 0.3% fee in V2 is kind of a continuation of the 0.3% fee in V1. Which came from a discussion between me and Vitalik, where it was a very short discussion. I was like, I had it at 0.25, and then I was like, I'm worried that it might be too low, and liquidity providers won't make enough. And he's like, you could try 0.3, and then I changed it, and then it never changed. But like the general thought that went into it was like it should be somewhat competitive with other kind of types of trading platforms. And we didn't want too much like active governance in V1 or in V2 even, just because it felt like the funny thing is that like, whatever the fee is, right, if it's 0.3 or 0.25 or 0.35, like there's probably like a different amount of liquidity where the market might kind of reach some sort of equilibrium. There definitely, for certain types of pairs, it would make sense to have like much lower, much higher fees. And it's something that we very much want to explore in V3. So we are working on a V3, and I'd say that like dynamic fees fall in the scope of that, where that is where we want to explore it more. But something that has kind of one of the reasons it wasn't in V1 and it wasn't in V2 is just because you always kind of have this trade-off when you introduce governance to systems, and we want to make sure that if we do implement like a dynamic fee, it's done in like the right way, where it doesn't kind of create weird incentives between different users of the system.
Cool, got it. All right, Benita accepts the answer. Awesome.
0.3% works for like a lot of use cases, surprisingly. For a lot of pairs, it actually works fairly well. I'll add that.
Cool. Awesome. So I think Vaibhav, I think that's how you pronounce that. I'm probably wrong. Are you able to? Okay, he won't be able to speak as well. All right, so I'll read out his question as well. So what are the solutions present that would prevent quote unquote bots to take majority liquidity pool portions of pairs, and the majority part of the fees being before a large trade hits the pool, leading to bribe/griefing of existing liquidity pools?
All right, that was mentioned in the discussion section of our audit report. So basically the idea is that like someone is making a swap, and then ahead of that swap, someone adds a ton of liquidity to the pool. And then at the end of that swap, they remove that liquidity. And so they got like a large portion of the fees for like a single trade. I think am I interpreting that correctly? I think so. I mean, the interesting thing there is basically what you're doing is you're increasing the liquidity for that trade, and you're actually improving the trade execution rate for that user. It's debatable if this is actually bad behavior. I don't know. I'm not actually 100% convinced it is bad behavior, because you're kind of taking on that price movement. You're giving a better trade, a better execution rate, and maybe it makes sense for you to kind of give. It's almost like should liquidity providers be actively withdrawing and adding liquidity constantly, or not? Based on kind of certain transactions or based on certain periods of time. But I'm not convinced it's like bad behavior at all. It improves the trade execution rate. So
cool, makes sense. I see another comment in here from Miles. I'm not sure, is that a question from you, Miles, or is more of a comment?
No, it's a question.
Okay.
Well, it's just kind of like thinking through this problem. I don't know if it's a direct question, but so I agree that it's easy to change to reason about the cost of artificially changing a price for a TWAP within a defined time. But if the attacker holds a large number of pool tokens for the pool that the TWAP is based off of, and then pulls them out right before their attack, how would you kind of handle that? Is there a way to handle that? Is that being handled in a way I don't fully understand?
wait, so
okay,
first,
yeah.
Go
ahead.
If the attacker holds a large number of pool tokens, and then they pull out the liquidity right before an attack. So okay, so you're talking about like the liquidity component of these sort of TWAPs, right? Is it like
the cost to change the price? Like you're saying, okay, if the TWAP has 1,000 blocks, then pushing down the price by this much costs this much. But if the attacker holds pool tokens and then pulls out a bunch of liquidity and then executes their attack.
Yeah. So that's actually a very interesting point. And there have kind of something that we've thought about a lot, which is like you do have this ability to get these TWAPs, but it's hard to get to know exactly what the liquidity balances was in the contracts at every moment in between, right? And so it is true that that's a very interesting scenario, but there are kind of interesting ways of handling it as well. So one thing that I've thought about as like a really interesting mitigation here is, for example, you could have an Oracle system. Let's say that you have a project that's using Uniswap V2 as an Oracle. It's very important for it to have liquidity for the safety of the Oracle itself. They could, one thing that they could do is they could direct a fee of, a small like fee stream maybe from their own system, and basically pay those fees to liquidity providers who time lock their liquidity tokens. And then you could basically have like liquidity that's guaranteed to be in the contract for like the duration that you care about. And you can make like stronger guarantees. So you can make guarantees by basically like, locking up liquidity tokens in a smart contract. It may be in the Oracle contract itself, which could give you like a very, very strong, like, which then you would be able to say, okay, well, I know for a fact that there was $1 million in this contract for this entire period because, the liquidity tokens were in the contract the entire time. So that's one interesting way to handle it. Or if the liquidity is ever withdrawn, the Oracle contract would know because it was pulled out of the Oracle contract itself.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. We've got a question from Trent.
So this is a little less technical, but I'm curious how you guys approach branding and memeing, and what % of your sort of product strategy is centered around picking the perfect emoji. Like, how long did it take to pick the unicorn emoji, and how important is that to your product strategy? Because given we've like typical financial institutions are like, it's very boring, like Bloomberg terminals. You guys have like pink gradients, you've got unicorns, you've got emojis. This is all great. This is the new paradigm of branding. But how did you get there?
A lot of it was very natural. I will say that, Khalil, who's, the design lead on our team, has been involved in the project actually since over a year before the V1 launch. So he was kind of actually working on like the UX design for the original interface, and actually even for the initial proof of concept before I got the Ethereum Foundation grant. So he's kind of been involved for a long time, and so there's definitely always been this like design element behind it. But I do think that a lot of the memeing and like the unicorn imagery, I think a lot of that was just like came naturally out of like the sort of the community and growth and excitement around it. We definitely kind of, I don't think a lot of it was like planned. I would say that like, maybe the unicorn emoji was like in the original UI. And that was maybe probably from Khalil, but the kind of, I think that it was really like the excitement and growth of the project itself that kind of fueled a lot of the memes, and then the memes kind of became a virtuous cycle where the memes then fueled like future excitement and growth and all that. We now obviously now it has become like a stronger brand, and it is something that we kind of think about more, and that's why we like kind of spent more time building out like the funny thing is that we were using the Apple emoji for a really long time, but you can't necessarily just use an Apple emoji as your logo forever. And so we worked on the kind of the newer branding that's on uniswap.org, and that we spent a lot more time and consideration on. But that was kind of after all the community stuff.
Cool. Mr. Will, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. So if you were to have just like a bunch of ETH that you wanted to like efficiently deploy into a Uniswap pair, so say the pair was like a token-to-token pair, like independent of ETH, and you wanted to swap on like a ETH token pair to get the appropriate amount of tokens for each side. Is there an efficient way to do this without having a lot of like dust left behind? Because I know you can use like either an arbitrary amount of ETH to get exact tokens or like vice versa, but how do you maximize that amount of ETH and still keep the right ratio of the two tokens?
Want to take that now?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting one. So we've seen, the kind of one other, a similar case to what you're describing is when you want to add to a ETH like token pair and you have ETH or you have the token. And that's actually more complicated, right? Because then you have to like figure out which fraction of the amount of ETH, for example, that you need to convert to tokens in order to like exactly match the ratio in the pair. And that actually involves like square roots and math, and it's actually never perfect. Or I mean, like there's almost always some dust. And so, but okay, you're asking a slightly simpler question, which is actually pretty interesting. Yes, there is a perfect way to do it without dust. You do need some slippage parameters to control the safety of the transaction, but the way it would work is basically like, token A and token B, and then there's a WETH token A, a WETH token B pair. So three total pairs. If you have some amount of ETH, you are going to want to like first look up what the price is in the token A, token B pair, and so that like the relative ratios, of A and B, and then basically what you're going to want to like look up the price of A WETH and B WETH, and then use the ratio to check how much getting exactly like some unit, like let's say the ratio is 5 to 1, right? Like check how much ETH it would require to get 5 tokens and then to get 1 token. And then swap for exactly that amount, and then you because you've looked up the price already that is the amount that you can add to the A-B pair. But actually thinking about it, I do think that there's going to be some roots involved, and so I actually don't know if it's possible to do without dust. I would need to like think about it a bit more. But the one thing to note is that if there's only a tiny amount of dust due to like rounding error math, it's typically like a trivial amount, and you can actually donate it to the pair. So like if you can't deal with this for whatever reason, and like you can't send it back to the user, or you don't want to, or whatever, it is possible to just like donate small amounts to pairs if it's, again, due to like rounding error and not like slippage. Because if it's slippage, you do need some parameters to control, like if the price changes dramatically between when the transaction is broadcast and confirmed, you need parameters to control that safety margin. But yeah, I don't know, it's a bit complicated, but it's probably possible.
I also just sent a link to the chat, which is our swap to price example contract. So that's basically doing what Noah was initially saying, which is like, if you want to buy up to an exact price, you can basically use that. This contract shows you how, and that maybe will help a little bit with kind of some of what you're saying. You can also ask us in the Discord. It's a little bit hard to do fully live vocally, but
I was messing around with it, so it is a little bit complicated to try and like do it efficiently. So I was seeing if you guys had some insight, which I'll check out this contract.
Yeah, you can check out that contract. Also in our Discord, you could also try to ping Dan Robinson. He spends a lot of time experimenting with Uniswap math, a lot of time, and so you might be able to get some interesting ideas from him as well.
Awesome, thanks.
Any other questions in the chat? Or in general, feel free to just unmute yourself at this point.
I mean, I'm also curious to just hear from Hayden and Noah about anything and everything, like something that we haven't brought up about the process of transitioning. Like, I'm sure you guys had like some sort of contingency plan. Like, once you deployed, what does that look like? What if shit hits the fan? I'm curious to see that side of
contingency plan. These are immutable smart contracts, Trent. No, really though, these smart contracts are immutable and non-upgradable. Something that like Uniswap V1 that differentiates it a lot from a lot of other projects, and Uniswap V2 even, is that like a lot of projects kind of have these sort of built-in upgradability migration stuff, where you can change the underlying code of the contract, or you can like move liquidity out of the contracts to other contracts. Uniswap V1 does not have anything like that. Uniswap V2 basically doesn't have anything like that either. But so kind of the process of upgrading Uniswap is very much like you have make a better version and convince people to use it because it's better. And the process it actually has gone a lot faster than I was expecting. So far, about I think $11 to $12 million have already moved from V1 into V2 since the V2 launch in like 3 days ago. And so that's like about now V2 is about 25% of V1, which is pretty cool considering it took like a year and a half for V1 to build up to that amount. So it does seem like a lot of people wanted to migrate over. One kind of the general thought is it is still like somewhat of like you saw like Maker, right? Maker had this sort of like longer transition period, and I think that Uniswap will see a similar thing. something that gives me a lot of confidence that like V2 will be the one that kind of gets more of the liquidity ultimately, is that there's all these things that V2 can do that V1 can't. And that kind of gives you like a lot of network effects. Where like, if you want these Oracle features, then you need liquidity in V2 and not in and you can't in V1. And if you want like, ERC20 pairs, you need it in V2. And if you want to kind of be able to do stuff that these flash swaps enable, you need it to be in V2. So sort of there's like all these like native use cases for V2 that like aren't possible with V1. And I think that will kind of lead to like more usage and traction on V2. But if people really, really hate it, they can stay on V1 because it's a non-upgradable smart contract. And who am I to force you to use the new one?
So is that kind of like your logic behind, I mean, the reason why you guys don't do upgradable smart contracts, and like, is that mostly because of those, like you mentioned earlier, like it's much more closer to like the core philosophy of Ethereum? Is that like the reason behind that?
Kind of. I mean, it's also just like this like practical thing. Like if I could migrate all liquidity on Uniswap, then no one using Uniswap would have any guarantee that their money is safe, right? Like right now, people can put their money in Uniswap. Like the entire reason that Uniswap, I think, has so much traction, because people can put their money in it and not have to worry about, if it will be there, because they obviously there are like various, possible like smart contract things or smart contract bugs, or like if the token itself has like some issue that like conflicts with like the Uniswap code or something. But like in general, like you have this like very high, like outside of some smart contract risk, that your liquidity on Uniswap, like it's in the pool tokens are in your wallet, they're your pool tokens. And like us having the ability to change the code underlying that just like kind of breaks that entire fundamental property in a way that we're not like really comfortable with. And I think would like drive away a lot of usage. In my mind, like I think people like it because it doesn't have those properties, and it does make it harder to iterate. And so that is like the trade-off you're making. But that's it's a trade-off that feels worth it to kind of keep these sort of underlying security properties.
Got it. Cool. I guess it also kind of incentivizes, when you guys do a new launch like a V2, that you make sure that it's worth people's while, right?
Yeah, if V2, I mean, yeah, and if V2, yeah, that's part of it. Definitely, like it means like you have to build a better version of the protocol if you want people to use it. But it's also like, I mean, if us messing up the V2 deploy meant like $50 million down the drain from like everyone who's ever used V1, like that's awful, right? Like we don't want that sort of dangling over the process, even though we are very security conscious. Like V2 was fully formally verified. It was built in a very security conscious way, even more so than V1. But still, it's like,
cool, makes sense. Sweet. I think we'll do one or two more questions and then probably look to wrap up. There's a question in the chat that says, what are some of the things that you would like to have built on top of V2? Maybe some like weird yield hacks you can think of. I guess just basically anything interesting that maybe you haven't seen or been thinking about, or maybe even too busy to build yourself.
Do you have any? I have some ideas, but also
not off the top of my head.
I guess one is definitely like more usages of, just because you said the word, there's a lot of things that would be cool to build on top of Uniswap, definitely like Oracle things, all that. But he mentioned yield hacks, and so I'll go off of that as a prompt. And like I'd say that like more kind of uses of liquidity tokens themselves. We've seen that a little bit with Aave. They recently announced that they're planning on adding like Uniswap liquidity tokens as a collateral source on Aave, and you can and then that basically allows you to kind of modify your exposure as a liquidity provider, where for example, if you were to let's say that you like one yield hack is basically like if you provide liquidity on like the ETH to DAI pair and you use the ETH to DAI liquidity tokens as your collateral, it's basically like, let's say you put in ETH and then you borrow if you put in ETH into Uniswap and you borrow the DAI component and then you use your liquidity tokens as collateral for that entire thing. Like let's say you almost did it out of order, right? Where the liquidity tokens at the end basically are the collateral used to borrow one of the two underlying tokens. That's like a very big fundamental change in like what the position is when you're a liquidity provider on that pair. Like now you're obviously paying like borrowing fees, but you're also like maybe earning lending fees if people want to borrow the pool tokens. But you basically are able to like reduce or remove your exposure from one of the two underlying assets, maybe reduce it or modify your exposure significantly. And I think that there's like all sorts of kind of cool yield hacks there when you start using pool tokens as collateral sources.
Very cool.
Just a quick one. At what point do you think you'll stop stop hosting the V1 front end? I know people hosting their own front ends kind of makes this not really matter, but when it gets under a certain threshold, or it'll just sort of exist, you'll link to it in perpetuity for people who maybe went on vacation for 5 years or something.
Okay, there's hosting. Hosting is one thing, developing is another thing, right? There's like, right, these front ends are like open source. A lot of people are running different forks of them as well. There's also like a lot of different interfaces to Uniswap. I'd say that like, only, I'd say that I think like less than 20% of the volume even would go through, one interface on Uniswap. Most of the volume is like from other interfaces, aggregators, on-chain integrations, arbitrage, like bots and like all these like native things. We're very much like a protocol company. And so like, that's definitely like even like the core focus. There is kind of this like, idea of like, how can we verify that like, or like, how can we trust like a specific like URL that we go to, which is maybe like a different issue from like hosting directly. And we'd kind of like prefer to kind of have like a mutable IPFS, like kind of like deploys. And then maybe we kind of like vouch for an IPFS deploy saying like, oh, we know this like matches like the underlying code that we believe is safe. That's like more of like a kind of a, in terms of like, we're not like really actively doing any development on the V1 version of the interface. It's kind of, we don't have, we're a small team. We can't really be maintaining multiple interfaces and also building a protocol. So we'd honestly like to see more like interface work move to other projects and other teams anyway. So the V1 interface will probably be hosted on like a permanent IPFS link or something. And other people can have forks that if they want to continue to maintain them. But it's not something that we want to like actively work on. But the V1 smart contracts, right? That's what's important. The V1 smart contracts will live on Ethereum forever and work forever. And, the code for the V1 interface will always be open source. So.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Sweet. I think barring any last minute questions, maybe we'll wrap it up here.
I agree with what Will said about flash swaps being used to kind of make the out of order.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, be sick. All right, cool. Well, I think with that being said, thanks so much, Hayden and Noah, and everybody else who came and attended for your questions, answers, everything. Really appreciate the chat. Looking forward to seeing what everybody's built at the end of this week. So for everybody who's watching, who's part of HackMoney, make sure you submit by the end of Sunday night. That is the deadline. If you miss it, there's no backseas. So make sure you get that. Make sure you get something in by Sunday night. And yeah, thank you so much again. And enjoy the rest of your hackathon and the rest of your days.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting this and having us.
Thanks, guys.
It's been an awesome event.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Take care, everybody. Bye.